In March 2021, RP Sanjeev Goenka Group acquired Dr. Vaidya's. In July 2023, Plix was acquired by Marico for rupees 600 crore. And last month in October 2024, Sesa Care was acquired by Dabur for 325 crore rupees. In the last 3 years, India has seen 82 consumer brand acquisitions. We've had $5 billion of equity financing, with $400 million coming in the last 6 months itself. And in the last 15 years, India has seen 3,000 new consumer brands being created. What has happened over the last few years is, as the disposable income in India has risen for a certain set of population, we are moving from unbranded to branded products. This is often known as premiumization, and it is because of this there is an explosion of consumer brands in India. And while I was spending time last month trying to dig deeper into the topic of consumer brands, I came across a great report from DSG Consumer Partners called the Game Changers Report 2024, the second edition. And the DSG Consumer Partners report explains how some consumer brand founders make 100 crore rupees from selling their company. Today's video is all about consumer brands. Welcome to Breakdown. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to Zerodha. This channel Breakdown is part of Zerodha's 01 network, and it's with their help and their resources that we're able to put together the research, the production, and the final output, which is this video, in your hands. Thank you so much. Let's get right into today's video. To understand why consumer brands are exploding in India, we need to rewind the clock to looking at why certain consumer brands ended up exploding in the US in the post-World War II era. There were a few brands that just went berserk. McDonald's really caught on in the 1940s, Tide detergent really took off in 1946, and the Barbie toy became a Main Street product by 1959. During this period, the Levi blue jeans almost became a cultural symbol in America, and owning a General Motors or a Ford vehicle became part of the American culture. And when we look back at history as to why this post-World War II period became a gold rush for consumer brands, there were primarily 4 things that happened in America. First was a rise in income levels. Real income, or the purchasing power of the average American, went up by 25% from 1945 to 1960. The second is consumerism absolutely took off in the US during this period. Less than 45% of America had an air conditioner in 1945. By the 1960s, that number was 90% plus. In 1945, there were less than 10,000 American households that had a TV. Exactly 10 years later, more than half the American population had a TV, and ad spend on televisions over this 15-year window went from about $3 billion to $12 billion. And typically what history tells us is that every time there is a new marketing channel that emerges, there is a new set of insurgent brands that emerge to capture the customer's fascination by dominating this new marketing channel. In the US, it was the television that was the mass market channel. Along with this emergence of the television, there was the emergence of a new channel for the sale of goods. And this is what we today call modern trade, which in the US is known as the supermarket and the hypermarket chains. Now, broadly, everything that I have said about America for this period from 1945 to 1960 has a time shift equivalent to what is happening in India right now and what has happened in the last 15 years. It's very clear that our per capita income has gone up. You've definitely seen the proliferation of purchase of TV, AC, fridge, etc., typically done on credit, and the credit card availability data in this country is a good indicator of how Indian consumerism is being driven by debt financing. In India, we have short form video, primarily Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, long format video like YouTube, which has created a new social media channel for brands to run advertisements. And there is also a new distribution channel to reach the customers, which in India is quick commerce. And therefore, there is right now a golden age for Indian commerce and Indian consumer brands. Now that we've looked at the history of why consumer brands took off in the US, let's look at the history of consumer brands in India. And there is a really nice pyramid diagram which I have taken from Accel Partners omni-channel report, which explains how consumer brands in India have evolved over the last few decades. We had a large number of local brands that were primarily introduced by the incumbent conglomerates, but we also also had the return of multinational giants like Coca-Cola that were forced to exit the country during the pre-liberalization era. This is the decade where HUL went on a massive brand acquisition spree and a massive growth spree. And that takes us to today's era, which is from 2012 onwards, according to the team at Excel Partners, where we've had an explosion of digital-first brands. Back in 2012, e-commerce in India was only a $14 billion market. By 2023, it had gone from 14 billion to 65 billion. At the same time, logistics enablers like Delivery and Expressbees have brought down the cost of logistics significantly. So these combination of factors, like the emergence of e-commerce as a strong distribution channel in India, has made the environment very favorable to start a consumer brand in India. Next, we'll come to some of the demand side factors that have resulted in the explosion of consumer brands today. Typically, consumer brands tend to be digital native, which is that these brands sell goods through online commerce channels or through WhatsApp or other informal commerce which is done through the internet. What has happened in the last decade? The India consumer internet penetration story has really played out. In 2008, we had 4.5 crore Indians on the internet. In 2024, there are 75 crore Indians who are active on the internet and they are discovering new brands through social media. Digital payments has taken off in India in a massive way. Monthly transacting users using UPI is now 300 million people, which means not only is the Indian consumer now online, but they are also comfortable making digital payments for these consumer brands. Our GDP per capita back in 2012 was $1,400. Today, it's about $2,400. In fact, if our stock market index has gone up 4x because of the wealth effect, which means you should expect that there's a significant part of the Indian population whose wealth has increased by so much in the last one decade that their spending capacity on consumer brands has also scaled up by a significant factor. And that typically means that as an economy progresses from being developing to developed, what tends to happen is premiumization kicks in, people seek branded products and branded experiences, and this is what results in the explosion of consumer brands. The first takeaway from the DSG Consumer Partners report is how do exits happen for consumer brands in India. And when we look at the data, the report tells us that in the last 3 years, there have been 82 acquisitions that have taken place, 17 IPOs that have taken place, and from these 82 acquisitions, there have been 72 exits to strategic acquirers in the last 3 years. Now, when DSG Consumer Partners uses the word strategic, they are typically referring to an incumbent consumer brand which will end up buying a small, fast-growing, social frenzy-driven consumer brand, mainly because a lot of the consumer brands grow primarily on online channels, and therefore as the owner of a consumer brand, you can typically expect that your most likely exit route is going to be a strategic acquisition or in an adjacent sector. Another insight from the DSG report is that 75% of these acquisition transactions are happening at a sticker price of under 800 crore or under $100 million. And a typical brand that is being acquired by a strategic is usually at about 100 crore rupees or about 12 to 13 million dollars of annual sales. And for those of you who are deep in the world of technology, you would say, hey Rahul, $100 million acquisition at 12 to 14 million dollars of annual revenue in the world of technology is not a large acquisition, and software companies hit this number almost on a regular basis. But remember that consumer brands are different from selling software. Consumer brands have an actual cost of goods sold. There is some raw material, there is some processing. The good has to be physically taken to the customer in a presentable box and it has to be of acceptable quality. And you'll be amazed to know, on average, it takes 9 years for the founder to take their brand from zero to this exit. And even after the 9 years, they would have to work for a few more years at the acquirer to realize the money from the sale of their business. The next takeaway is how much are these consumer brands being sold for? So according to DSG, a typical consumer brand is sold for about $24 million or 250 crore rupees, and it takes about 11 years to go from idea to exit via acquisition. A typical IPO is about 2,600 crore rupee valuation, and it takes 23 years from idea to IPO. Again, for those of you you who track the world of technology, you would say that a 250 crore or a 2600 crore rupee exit is not very large given the fact that a venture capital firm might have a AUM of about 2000 to 3000 crores. But remember that from an investor perspective, your typical consumer brand is raising at a much lower valuation than a SaaS company. Along with this, a typical consumer brand does not have as high a rate of failure as a software company, and therefore even if the outcomes are capped, the fact that the base rate or the probability of failure in starting a consumer brand is much lower compensates both the entrepreneur and the investor for the risk of doing a consumer brand business. According to the team at DSG Consumer Partners, is that because founder ownership in consumer brands is so high, even though the actual size of the sale is low, the absolute amount of money that you make as the founder of a consumer brand from an exit is still very much life-changing. Now, I'll just pause and remind you that companies like Swiggy, which operate as logistics companies, raised a series A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. At some point, if they did anything more, they'd run out of alphabets. And remember that in each one of these equity financing rounds, the founder's ownership of their company continues to reduce because in a new round of equity financing, you are giving out more shares to incoming investors. Now, unlike logistics and SaaS businesses, consumer brands typically tend to be quite capital efficient. They don't raise as many rounds of financing, and in a lot of cases, consumer brands are even bootstrapped, which means they've not raised any equity financing externally. Therefore, founder ownership in consumer brands tend to be much higher than founder ownership in most other types of companies. Now, according to DSG, typically 75% of consumer brands are entirely bootstrapped, and therefore a typical founder owning 82% equity of their company in the typical acquisition in consumer brands in India walks home with at least $9 to $10 million, and that, my friends, is definitely life-changing money for literally everyone who decides to start a consumer brand. Next up, for those of you who are consumer brand founders, a major question you might have is, what are the multiples at which companies are being acquired? And that will help you understand how much your company could be worth in the event that you get an acquisition offer. Now, there are two types of multiples. For companies that are profitable and that are going for an IPO, you get valued as a multiple on your profits. And for consumer brands that are at the earlier stages and you're going in for a strategic acquisition or an acquisition by a private equity firm, typically you get acquired as a multiple of your revenue or your sales because your brand may have not become large enough to be profitable. And the main reason for this is you might have some corporate staff overhead which takes your brand from the zone of profitability to the zone of loss. So the numbers according to DSG in terms of revenue multiples and profit multiples are very interesting. Typically for an apparel brand, you would get a 2x multiple on your revenue. For a BPC, beauty and personal care, you would get a 4.6x multiple on your revenue. And in food and beverage, you would get a 2.4x multiple on your revenue. And most people would think that they'll get a 5 to 10x revenue multiple. And when it comes to acquisitions in the apparel category, you get an EBITDA multiple of 23x. In food and beverages, you get an EBITDA multiple of 31x. Now, so far we have discussed the average case as shared by DSG Consumer Partners, but DSG also provides a best case. Now, the best case has certain criteria in terms of compound annual growth, CAGR, which is how much your revenue is scaling year on year, and a requirement in terms of ROCE, which is return on capital employed. And typically ROCE is a measure of the efficiency of your business to take capital invested and to pull earnings out of the bucket. There is another metric called capital efficiency. Capital efficiency simply says how much sales or earnings are you able to generate relative to the amount of money that you have burnt so far to build this brand. Typically, according to DSG Consumer Partners, in the best case for an acquisition, if you have a capital efficiency of 1.5x, which means your annual sales or annualized sales is about 1.5 times the total capital burn, and if you have a compound annual growth rate of about 30%, then you would get a revenue multiple of 5.1x. That is really generous. And this is why if you're building a consumer brand, one of the takeaways here is to really think about return on capital employed and to really focus on your capital efficiency efficiency, because that is what is going to drive the valuation of your business. If you've built a consumer brand that is fast growing with frugal DNA, it's just obvious that someone is going to pay a higher price to acquire your business. So hopefully now, as a consumer brand founder, you understand what are some of the benchmarks in terms of revenue multiples, in terms of revenue thresholds at which your business could be an interesting acquisition target for a strategic or for private equity. And hopefully you've also got an idea of what it would take for you to get a best-in-class acquisition by tracking your return on capital employed, your capital efficiency, and your revenue CAGR. I'd encourage you that if you are the owner of a consumer brand, or if you're thinking about starting a consumer brand, you should read through the DSG Consumer Partners report more carefully, because you will find insights specific to the particular category that your business gets categorized under. Whether it is apparel, BPC, or F&B, there are a set of industry-specific insights as well that DSG Consumer Partners provides you. I next want to tell you about an interesting theme in the consumer brand space in India, which is building from India for the rest of the world. Now, this theme of build in India, sell to the world is especially popular in India because of software. And India's largest software success of building here, selling in the West is Freshworks, which sells CRM software. And while it is true for software that you build in India, sell to the world, this is also true of consumer brands. And there is a very good reason for this being the case. As Indians, we somehow love everything Western. Alan Solly, Fred Perry, and Louis Philippe are actually owned by an Indian conglomerate, Aditya Birla Group. And another example of an Indian brand that has really cracked the build in India, sell to the world phenomenon is Vadham Teas. Vadham Teas was founded in 2015, and even as early in 2019 when I was in the UK, a lot of my colleagues working with me who were not Indian had heard of Vadham Teas and had even purchased Vadham Tea products because they had seen the ads on social media, or they had got a product recommendation from their friends. In fact, Vadham Teas in the United States is present at 4,000 CVS health stores. Another observation that I'd like to share with you about consumer brands in India is that there is a generational aspect to consumer brands as well. There are three great examples of this. Madhav, who is the founder of Vadham Teas, is a fourth generation family member operating in the tea industry, and his original family business was running a tea shop in Darjeeling all the way back in 1931. Arjun Vaidya, the founder of Dr. Vaidya's, is also a fourth generation Ayurvedic practitioner. His family business was in the Ayurveda care space. And finally, Ankit Chona, who is the founder of Hocko Ice Creams, was from the family that had started Havmore Ice Creams, which got sold to Lotte Group. And after the family completed the non-compete window, he went straight in to start Hocko Ice Creams, leveraging the family's distribution experience and the distribution network. Now, you might say, Rahul, it's so unfair that there are some people who have this massive family backing and family knowledge that allows them to build a consumer brand. They obviously have some unfair advantages, but it's not necessarily the case that they are the only ones who can build a consumer brand. They obviously have some advantages in terms of their friends and family network to be able to raise money. But when you rewind the clock, a lot of successful businesses are not necessarily built by an experienced founder, by a founder with a lot of unfair advantage. Entrepreneurship is still fairly democratic, and success rates for any founder, regardless of family backing, tend to be quite all over the place. So don't be disheartened because you see certain consumer brands breaking out very fast because the owner has a family business in that domain. But consumer brands is the vast ocean, and there is enough opportunity for you to also start a consumer brand. The first opportunity, food and beverage opportunities, and this is quite frankly because in India we absolutely love food. Food is also the category in which most of the consumer brand acquisitions are taking place right now. So the question is, what are some of the ingredients for building a good F&B brand in India? Broadly speaking, one of the playbooks in flavor is localization of international cuisines and international dishes which are popular in the West or popular in the East but brought to India. If you look at McDonald's, Domino's and few other fast food chains globally have an entirely separate menu in each country in which they operate. And therefore, if you are able to pick an international cuisine or an international dish bring it to India, customize the flavor, the presentation for the Indian palate, you could be sitting on top of a gold mine. And a recent example of this that I'll share with you is one of my portfolio companies called Boba Bhai. Boba Bhai started out by offering Korean burgers and Taiwanese bubble tea, and both of these products absolutely took off. What are some of the other options there? You might have the answer. Another angle to flavor is to think about nostalgia. I'm sure you have seen the paper boat Aam Panna ad campaign, which takes the viewer back in time to when they would have fresh Aam Panna, and that same freshness, that same nostalgia, that memory and joy comes out in the paper boat advertisement. On the other hand, Indians love spices, and if you look at something like Viva sauces, then that's a great example of a business which has understood the Indian taste palette and created a range of sauces that can complement Indian cuisine and Indo-Chinese and other fusion cuisines that are popular in India. Another opportunity in food and beverages is healthy but tasty. Now, according to the DSG Consumer Partners report, 43% of customers feel that healthy means less tasty, and 50% of customers have modified their diet to be healthier. And I do think healthy but tasty is another interesting opportunity for you as a food and beverage entrepreneur. A great example of this in yogurt and milk products is Epigamia. They've made Greek yogurt, which was earlier bland, uninteresting, to be a slightly more exciting, interesting, flavorful and tasty consumer product. Another angle to health and tasty is to see what Shashank and his team at the Whole Truth Foods have done. One of the major problems with health food consumers is that there is a trust gap or a lack of trust. And if you've been looking at social media recently with food bloggers like Food Farmer, the trust gap has even widened further because now consumers completely distrust anything and everything they read about the ingredients. But what Shashank has done at Whole Truth Foods is, with a combination of content and a combination of authenticity, they have conveyed these are our ingredients, these are the shortcomings of our ingredients, but at least we are telling you the whole truth. So you can take some of these learnings for your consumer brand as well. Now, on the topic of healthy plus tasty, I'll rewind the clock to a few minutes ago when I told you that every time a new distribution or a new advertising channel emerges, there is an opportunity for insurgent consumer brands to beat out incumbent consumer brands. In India right now, we have this shift from e-commerce to quick commerce, and one of the boon or the benefit of quick commerce is that it caters to the cravings of people. So in 10 minutes on quick commerce, you can end up getting a bowl of chips, you can end up getting an ice cream, which is what Go Zero has absolutely cracked. In fact, 70% of Go Zero's ice cream sales are driven on the quick commerce channel. Go Zero is tapping into the indulgence which happens when you are hungry, you want a snack, and you just place an order on Zepto, Blinkit or Instamart. You can also think about how you can flip indulgence and provide customers with a few healthy snacks, which you will now start to see take off on quick commerce. And the data on quick commerce is quite clear. For Nestle India, 50% of their online sales are now happening through the quick commerce channel. So if you are a consumer brand founder, you today cannot ignore quick commerce, and in fact, you should be making an effort to get your product onto quick commerce if it meets certain criteria. The criteria, it's a fairly low AOV, so you can make an impulse purchase. It caters to some form of impulse, either snacking, indulgence, boredom, etc. It is a product which has a small size and can therefore be delivered efficiently. So after taste, flavor, health, and channel, the next potential ingredient to building a successful consumer brand would be to think about sustainability, if it is relevant to your brand and to the audience that you believe would most resonate with your brand. There is a certain segment of the Indian population that is willing to pay a premium for a sustainable brand or a brand that promotes sustainability. And a great example of this is Fool, which sells incense sticks or agarbatti that are made with recycled flowers that are collected from temples and other places of worship. So to summarize some of the learnings on what it takes to build a successful insurgent consumer brand, as per DSG Consumer Partners, the formula is having some form of product value at the core, whether that product value is healthy but but tasty, convenience in terms of the choice of channel that you have or the channels that you prioritize, innovation on flavors, especially true for F&B, and if relevant, some sustainability angle. And you need to combine this core product or consumer offering with a price point that makes it attractive to the customer. You have to have some element of brand memorability. And as we said, a great example of brand memorability is The Whole Truth Foods, because they tell you the whole truth. So it's a very nice play on words. You need to have discoverability across multiple channels. So just because quick commerce is working for you doesn't mean that you stick to just e-commerce. And finally, the least understood aspect of cracking the insurgent consumer brand playbook is to have some element of business model innovation, which usually involves supply chain innovation. So some of your best consumer brands are what we would describe as vertically integrated, which means that they are sourcing the raw materials, they are processing the raw materials, they are packaging the product, and they are delivering it to you. And if you are able to control this entire experience, not only do you shrink your cost basis, which in consumer brands then allows you to spend more on marketing or have more margin to push into your P&L, but it also gives you an edge in terms of the quality of product, the quality of experience that you deliver to your end customer. And if you believe that true consumer brands scale off the back of customer love, having control over the quality of the product and the experience that you give them is a major driver of consumer brand success. So that's the playbook in a nutshell. Now that you know what your brand can get acquired for and on what basis it can be acquired, all I can say is best of luck. And I do hope that if you start a consumer brand, you don't end up getting acquired, but you're one of those people who goes big, has a great acquisition. And that's all for today's video on consumer brands. I'd encourage you to go read DSG Consumer Partners report. The link is in the description of this video. That's all for today's breakdown, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.